Yeah, thanks, Deputy Speaker. And this is my first time coming in virtually, so hope that you can hear me okay. And one thing that doesn't change when you're coming in virtually is the member for Bowman and that curious speech that he just gave, but I'll leave it to the member for Leongatha and other people with some more in-depth knowledge to school him at a later time. Can I just say one thing, having spent some time recently with First Nations artists in the Northern Territory, painting and expressing culture is about so much more than selling artwork. It's about describing, communicating law, culture, families, dreaming. It's an important part of their culture. It's not simply something to be traded. And I think the member for Bowman's ignorance in some of these issues belies the problem we have with realising the deep potential of Indigenous exceptionalism. Recently here in the Northern Territory, the Children's Commissioner has reported that 1 in 3 NT kids are living in poverty. So we've got a great deal of work to be done here. This legislation might be part of the solution, but I think it'll only be part. It is important. It's not perfect, as the member for Leongatha mentioned earlier. There's so much that needs to be done to lift up the standards, but to think it's all going to happen through enterprise and not from concerted government action, both at the federal level, the NT government level, and at the local council level or the local government level, is naive or probably naive at best, but probably at worst, a deliberate attempt to defund organisations, programs that are slowly but surely leading to better outcomes. Having said that, let me reflect on land rights for a little while. Of course, here in the Northern Territory, we live on the front line when it comes to the matter of Aboriginal land rights. And was a hard-fought battle by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leaders to begin that process of achieving some form of compensation for their significant losses during the period of European colonial settlement. There was a way for them to regain their connection and rights to the land that was taken from them, often and nearly always without their consent, and to strengthen that connection with their lands, their traditional lands, with a connection in law. Now, that movement had a massive impact here in the Northern Territory. These days, about half of the Northern Territory is now recognised as Aboriginal land. And given that Indigenous Territorians, Aboriginal Territorians, represent about a third of our population, consulting with this population has always been paramount here in the Northern Territory. So I'm happy that these amendments have come about in part through some extensive consultation with the Northern Territory's 4 Aboriginal land councils. Like the member for Leongatha did, I do commend the Minister for that. The Northern and Central Land Councils and the Tiwi and Andiliaqua Land Councils have all played a part in helping to shape this bill. They themselves have called for these changes, and I quote, "the most significant set of reforms since the Land Rights Act came into effect in 1976, end quote. I'm really pleased that this has occurred, and I'm very supportive, and Labor is very supportive of any measures that support the economic empowerment of Indigenous Australians. So as already been mentioned in this debate, there are 4 major sets of changes being made to the Aboriginal Land Rights Act, and I won't go into them all here today, and I stress that they're not all perfect. But firstly, the bill seeks to establish a new Northern Territory Aboriginal Investment Corporation as an Aboriginal-controlled corporate Commonwealth entity funded from the existing ABA, or the Aboriginal Benefits Account. Now, as others have said, the ABA was established almost 70 years ago and extracts those royalties from mining on Aboriginal land. The federal government currently makes decisions about investment and other payments from the ABA and takes advice from the ABA Advisory Committee. But under this bill, the new Aboriginal Investment Corporation, the NT, would be established and will make investment decisions mostly independently of government. The idea is that it will promote self-management and economic self-sufficiency, as well as the social and cultural well-being of Aboriginal people in the NT, which of course is hugely important. It will be led by a board of 8 Aboriginal representatives from the NT, 2 each from the 4 land councils, 2 government-appointed directors and 2 independent directors appointed by the board. The new body will also take over responsibility for making beneficial payments to Aboriginal communities in the Northern Territory that are currently made by the ABA. This is a big deal. The ABA holds considerable funds, currently about 1.3 billion, which is accumulated from mining royalties. The government has said that the Aboriginal Investment Corporation will initially receive $500 million from the ABA, with an additional 60 million per year during the first 3 years of its operation. And that represents a lot of money to be spent for the betterment of Aboriginal Australians here in the Territory. One thing that needs further thought, I think, is a range of investments that the NTAIC can make to build revenue. I think there needs to be a wide variety of investments to enable the revenue to keep growing and for the ongoing investments to benefit Aboriginal communities. Regarding the makeup of the board, there is now a disproportionate weighting in favour of the 2 smaller land council, and also there's no board representation from non-traditional owners. As the member for Lingiari said, I think that shows a certain level and a significant level of grace from the northern and central land councils, representing, as they do, a lot bigger percentage of Aboriginal Territorians. But we need to ensure that representation's fair and that investment and spending is done fairly across the Northern Territory. Also, I'd like to note that currently the ABA's funds can only be invested in cash accounts, term deposits or investment-grade securities like government bonds. Now, over the more than 40 years since the Land Rights Act came into effect, the return on those such investments has indeed declined a lot. It's dropped to about 1/3 of what it once was. And although the establishment of the AIC addresses this in part, more than 620 million will remain with the ABA. Now, the ABA's mining royalty income is likely to drop off in the near future as the Groot Island manganese mine, which currently provides about 2/3 of mining revenue to the account, is scheduled to stop operating in the coming years. So perhaps it's time to look at a higher return investment strategy so that the ABA will be able to meet its legislated functions into the future, which includes covering land councils' operating expenses so that they can do their important work. Another concern about one of the changes, which gives the Minister increased control over the remaining ABA balance. As we heard from the member for Lingiari, there was a time when former federal ministers for Aboriginal affairs made decisions that were inconsistent with benefiting Aboriginal people in the Northern Territory. So even though the federal Labor team would also always be taking a sensible and legal approach to these issues, we need to make sure that no matter what government is in, the legislation supports and keeps accountability for ministers to be doing the right thing by Aboriginal people in the Northern Territory. There's currently no legislated scheme in place to provide for advice to be made to the minister so that the payments from ABA would be solely at ministerial discretion. That's problematic, Deputy Speaker, as I just said, because quite frankly, I don't have a lot of faith in those opposite doing the right thing always in these circumstances. No reflection on the current minister, but it has been supported by history. We have also seen, I won't dwell on this too long, Mr Deputy Speaker, but we've also seen our ministerial discretion has been abused by a variety of Commonwealth grant programs in recent times. We've seen the outrageous sports rorts, car park rorts, last week's heavily imbalanced spending by the BBRF, the Building Better Regions Fund, which of course skewed towards coalition seats. Now, I don't want to see even more political spending and manipulation of public funds that are meant to support and uplift some of our most vulnerable people. Surely we need a strong advisory mechanism in place to protect the ABA's funds, to build and maintain trust, and to make sure the grants are made fairly and transparently. I'm sure all honourable members would agree. I do hope there's consideration made of this. On another note, I'd like to acknowledge the ABA investment, their interest in the Cultural Centre in my electorate of Solomon here in Darwin. This is going to be a magnificent development that aims to showcase and celebrate Larrakia culture and history and to help maintain it for generations to come. It also aims to help foster economic independence for Larrakia people and be economically sustainable, and I welcome it. Looking after land and sea, as the Larrakia have been doing for millennia, is important. It's important to all First Nations people. It will help to maintain existing ties and build new relationships with other Indigenous people, not just in Australia and the Pacific, but globally. And Mr Deputy Speaker, Labor has welcomed the repeal of Section 28A of the Aboriginal Land Rights Act, which we opposed when the Howard government introduced it. It was a brazen attempt to split and undermine the authority of land councils, and I'm very happy to see that it's been removed. Also welcome the repeal of Section 74A, which former Prime Minister Howard brought in as part of the NT intervention. That section prevented land councils from overturning permits for accessing Aboriginal land that may have been granted by a community minority, but against the wishes of traditional owners. There are other changes in this bill regarding processes around negotiation, consent and approval of exploration and mining ventures on Aboriginal land in the Northern Territory. That should reduce inefficiencies and delays without, and I stress, Mr Deputy Speaker, without compromising the rights of traditional owners. I do note that the NT's 4 land councils are strongly supportive of this bill, as is the Minerals Council of Australia. And I'd like to quickly pay tribute to Drew Wagner, who is the outgoing CEO of the Minerals Council of the NT, for the work that he's done. He's been a powerful advocate for Aboriginal people to be able to create jobs and wealth from the assets of their land while seeking to protect the environment and upholding the concerns of landowners and custodians of that land. And I wish him all the best for the future. I'd also like to acknowledge the work of Marion Scrimgeour, Labor's very strong candidate for Lingiari, but the reason I bring her up in this context is that over her political career as Minister and Deputy, as a Minister and the Deputy Chief Minister in the Northern Territory government, she was a powerful voice for Indigenous communities, and she was also the first female CEO of any land council in the NT when she was appointed head of the Northern Land Council. She's been a trailblazer and a fighter, and I commend her for that work. I know she'll be an excellent member for Lingiari after the next election and an excellent advocate for Indigenous people across our nation. Overall, Mr Deputy Speaker, despite some concerns I've mentioned here today, there is a lot to support in this bill, and I believe it represents some very necessary and overdue progress in this space. And I encourage all members to consult widely and to think deeply about issues involving First Nations people in our nation. And I encourage them to take to their hearts the Uluru Statement from the Heart, and the legitimate want of First Nations people in our nation to have a voice, to have the truth told, and to reach agreements about land.
Order. The
Thanks,
member's
Speaker.
time